Hello and welcome to another edition of the Brattlecast, featuring Ken Gloss, the proprietor of the Brattle bookshop in Boston, one of the great landmarks, one of the great historic spots you have to stop in. Paul Giamatti recently did when he filmed the movie. We'll talk more about that at some other point. But Ken, it's great to see you. This is Jordan with Ken. You brought in a bunch of maps, and I have a question before you get to what the content is. Do you know how to fold them?
Sometimes.
An honest answer, okay.
Well, actually, a lot of times when people bring me in maps that they want us to see, and I ask them to unfold them because some of them, when you're actually doing that, they're so fragile that they'll tear or rip, and you almost can't avoid it. Yeah. And I don't want to be the one.
Let the customer do it.
If it's mine and I bought it, fine. That's my problem.
Gotcha.
But the last thing I need is to be opening one in front of a customer and have them go, hear the...
Yeah, that would not be a good start to the relationship. So the maps you're talking about are obviously quite old and quite venerable. And what's the theme of these maps?
Well, these two maps are two different maps of Boston. And one of the reasons I brought these, there's a really great exhibit at the Boston Public Library right now on MBTA maps and the transit system maps. And, people, when you collect maps, it sounds simple, but you can collect maps about the country, about the world, about a city, about a place, about space, about anything. And even when you're getting here, I brought two maps of Boston because I'm in Boston and I like him. But even those, they're so different in what they show and what you can learn and why they can be important that each one has a story of its own.
Yeah, they have a historical record based on when they were composed.
They have a historical record of when they not only do they have a historical record of when they're composed, showing the world there, but many times it depends on who's making the map. In other words, if you do a map of the world and you say unexplored, territories, well, there are people living there who maybe you were the unexplored ones.
Yes.
But a lot of it comes from the perspective of the map maker. Many of them go into who's discovering whose place is it. And then some of them, like the map, one of the maps I just brought, is how things change over time. And it shows you not only the geography, but a lot of times the economy.
I'm always fascinated by cartography in the old days, the fact that they were able to figure out kind of where things were in their world simply by exploring and using the technology of the time.
Well, they explored technology of the time and then sometimes made it up.
Yeah. When in doubt, make it up.
Well, the other thing that you run into with maps like that is, yeah, exactly. You don't, not all the map makers knew exactly what they were doing. They were presuming this. Or if you look at some of the very, very old maps, there's where there be dragons. In other words, around the edges, there are dragons and mythical figures because they have no idea what was there. But they can also be a lot of fun. And you can go from old to new to transit to building to, there's so many.
So let's talk about one of those maps that you brought in. And first of all, the era, the time that it was composed.
This is a Boston directory. Mm-hmm. It's from 1803, and it has a map with it. Now, again, this is going to go over a little bit more for the people who are in Boston, but Boston's just a little peninsula. Mm-hmm. There isn't a whole lot of land. And then you have the Charles River, but the Charles River is the Back Bay.
Exactly.
And the Boston waterfront comes in, and there's a section here that is just Washington Street. Then when high tide came, it literally was an island. Or for those of you who also know it, there's a pond called Mill Pond. That's where Mass General Hospital in that area is now. It was actually all water.
So much landfill and in that era, right?
Well, so much landfill, and it showed that there was a lot of wealth, there was a lot of building, there was a lot of expansion, and you can watch these maps from one era to the next, to the next, to the next, and see how the city grew. But also, while the city was growing, you could see how the population grew. You could see the technology that went into a lot of the filling and building, where essentially if you go down, you hit water. And so it's fascinating. But I think one of the first things that hits you immediately is, that's Boston?
Tell me more about the book that the map is part of.
Actually, when I was saying that this has a lot to do with the business, this is a book. It's a directory, and it's listing all the people and the businesses in the city of Boston.
Sort of a Yellow Pages of its time.
As of 1805. Now, directories went up probably through recently, and now they're dropping out because instead of printing a directory and all businesses, it's all online. And then, of course, Yellow Pages and phone books were the next level in a way of this. And
so if you're looking for a milliner or a retailer or an innkeeper, you can look them up. They're alphabetical, and it tells you where they are on what street and so forth.
Exactly.
Wow, that's really cool. And I notice, I'm just completely at random, Richard Cook, ropemaker, and it's Pleasant Street, but the S in both Pleasant and Street looks like an F, so it's Old English, right?
It's Old English, and think about it. The trade of ropemaker was incredibly important for a seafaring community because all the boats and the ships and the ropes and the pulleys, and so the life comes together with that, and then you can sort of put it in places and pictures. And if you have, let's say, the 1810 atlas or 8 directory, the 1825, the 1850, you can see the city grow. Now, the next map I have here is a little bit more fragile, but it's from the 1860s, 1863, and it's an auction catalog, and it's 42 lots of land on the Back Bay. And on September 29th, 1863, and Jordan, if you want to bid on buying some land in Boston,
I wonder what kind of a deal I could get in 1863.
Well, do you know what's even nice about this one? Is that if you really look at it, it unfolds a little bit more, but it even fills in a lot in here of what the land went for.
Oh, my goodness.
And it was a relatively few dollars a square foot. If you were at on Beacon Street or some of the others, they fill in, and I assure you, you can't get that land for that price now.
This is obviously Boston-centric, but I'm going to mention this. The street names in the Back Bay are alphabetical: Arlington, Berkeley, Clarendon.
But then
Dedham instead of
Dartmouth.
Dartmouth, right? So that was changed.
And then you also see the way they have it laid out. There are little spots that never occurred, never came.
So this is what was going on in 1863
during the Civil War.
Wow, amazing! And in those days, you could get a nice plot of land in Back Bay for next to nothing compared to today.
A couple of dollars a square foot. But of course, you also, if you had a year's salary, it might be $100 or $200 for a laborer.
Now, this kind of a map would benefit more than just the consumers. This would benefit the people selling the plots. And
the whole purpose of this was, it was an auction.
Yeah.
And they were saying, this sale, we're going to auction off these lots of land. So the whole map, the real idea behind it was selling the land.
Right.
But they were also trying to show you who was already there, because it has the names of a lot of the families that already bought, and then what was going to come up, what the area was going to look like in the future. It's like nowadays, if you went to a subdivision that's just being built, you'd say, well, you want to buy in this subdivision. And
not for nothing, Ken, but I'm looking at some of the names, and they appear to be Brahmin names for
100
the most part.
I would say almost 100%.
I don't see any Kellys, O'Reillys, or Goldbergs at the moment.
No.
Yeah,
And probably, and this is where you also get into it, is probably if there was a very rich Kelly, O'Reilly, or Goldberg, they wouldn't have sold. They wouldn't have let them buy the land.
Exactly. They wouldn't have sold to the Irish or the Jews or the Italians. They
Right.
would have kept them out. Talk a little bit about, it says plan of lands belonging to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Do you know in your history if there was a particular office in government that oversaw maps, regulated maps? So that
there was offices that did have maps, but I don't think it was one central map in this area. If you got the Water Commission reports, they had maps showing all the water and the pipes and the drainage. If you got the park area maps, they had park commissions. They also had real estate and atlases, and those weren't done necessarily by the state. A lot of those were done by the banks and the insurance companies because they wanted to know who had all the land, where it was, who we're mortgaging to, what's available, who owns it. So, and that progressed to time. Matter of fact, a great map sometimes, well, this one would be great for someone who owns one of these properties in the Back Bay now. But a lot of times there will be a map of the suburbs, and this was all over the country, the city and the suburbs. And you can get an 1890 map or a 1920 map of where you just bought a house. They make wonderful housewarming presents.
just for the listeners who are always thinking about value and what things might go for, maps at this type and this genre and this era, what would we be talking about? What value do they have?
This map is a very, very rare map, and this would probably sell in the $1,200, $1,500 range, maybe even a few thousand. And it would also be a map that if you didn't buy it now, you might not get a chance to buy it again. The one that's in the directory, they put out more of those because look at all the names in the directories, and probably a good portion of those people bought the directory at the time.
Right.
So that map is probably about a $300 to $500 map.
And another question that I'm sure our listeners are dying to know, what kind of stock do you have at the Brattle Bookshop in terms of maps? You must have a slew.
Well, we get a lot in, but almost any question that you ask of what we have at the Brattle Bookshop, it depends on where we went yesterday,
Yes.
which house we were at, or who came in to buy things the day before. There was a big developer in Boston. His name was Norman Leventhal.
I remember the name.
And he collected maps of Boston. And the reason he got interested in them, he developed big properties throughout the city, and it just made him interested. Who was there? What's the old maps? The history of it. He gave his whole collection to the Boston Public Library. He funded the whole
The Leventhal Center, yes.
Right. But before he did all that, if we had any great maps of Boston and he happened to have walked in the store and you came in the next day, we didn't have them.
Yeah, it's just like so many of your regular customers, he knew where to go.
Right, and so anytime you walk into a used and rare bookstore and you're collecting in a certain area, it depends on what's come in the last few days, what your relationship, this is where the personal part comes in, what your relationship is with the owner, because they might have 10 collectors who collect that, but if you're their favorite, then you get the first call.
So note to the listeners, always be kind to the man behind the counter, particularly when he owns the store.
or at least make them think you're kind.
Absolutely. Well, you drew a good map of a story here. And speaking of stories, in future episodes, we're going to delve into your story book. And it's basically one-liners that we're going to build stories on. Ken, as always, thank you so much. And you folded that beautifully, by the way.
Maybe.
Well, okay.
Not quite.
It's worth that much. I'm not going to touch it. He's Ken Gloss. I'm Jordan Rich. Go to brattlebookshop.com. And thank you so much for listening.
And now it's folded. Thank you.